What's your most disturbing, scary, or creepy real story? Story 1. I was outside playing with friends one afternoon. We were around 9 or 10 years old. We lived in a quiet area. As we were playing, we noticed a man in a truck drive by repeatedly. Each time he passed my friend's yard, he would drive slowly. We eventually realized that this man was recording us with one of those old handheld camcorders. It really freaked us out. We ran inside their house and called his mom. She told them they needed to stay inside and that I should go home. I tried to explain that my mom wasn't home at the moment, but she still made me leave. I lived about a mile or two down the road. I've never run so fast in my life. I was terrified that man was going to find me as I ran back home. When my mom found out what happened, she was extremely upset that my friend's mom hadn't let me stay at their house until she could come pick me up. Story 2. I'd been living in my first apartment alone for maybe 2 weeks. It was a basement apartment, which meant cheap rent, and the windows were right at ground level so you could see legs and shoes walk by. There were 2 bedrooms. I slept in one with the blinds closed, but the other room's window had some water damage, so I kept the blinds all the way up to let it dry out before maintenance came. That room had nothing in it but spare boxes from moving in. One night I was asleep and then suddenly completely awake and alert. Every fiber of my being was suddenly on edge. I looked at my phone and saw it was around 4 a.m. I lay in bed for a minute before I turned toward my closed window and saw it. A large dark shadow of a person with a flashlight trying to see into my bedroom. I instantly panicked. I quietly grabbed a small hunting knife and stealthily moved to the hall so I could see into the other bedroom, the one whose window coverings were wide open. As I peeked around the corner, the person was scanning the floor of my bedroom methodically with the flashlight. They were big, had on heavy boots, and had keys that jingled. At this point, as a single girl alone in a cheap apartment, I thought this was it. I was 100% prepared to take my little hunting knife and defend myself. My adrenaline was sky high. At that moment, my phone buzzed, and I got a text from a friend on the police force who literally asked, "What's going on at your apartment?" I thought, yep, this is serious. There's someone peering in my windows who's about to break in. But then they went away. I didn't hear from my police friend again after I texted him back. I decided to lie back down on my bed and just wait to see what happened next. Not 5 minutes after lying down, someone knocked on my door with incredible force. The panic came back. Now, I had no peephole, no safety chain, just a deadbolt. At the top of my voice, in case it was a criminal, I yelled to wake up the neighbors. "Who is it?" I heard a meek voice reply that it was the police. My first thought was that this was a clever trick to get someone to open the door. I stood there silently before I heard the voice say again that I wasn't in trouble. I opened the door a crack, ready to slam it shut, and saw 2 officers, one backed away from the door and one up the steps. They must have seen my tiny little knife or something. They proceeded to apologize for scaring me. It turns out they were the ones looking in my windows. I yelled at them and might have cried a little. The adrenaline finally broke, okay? I got the full story from my friend the next day. Apparently, a resident in the apartment complex had gotten drunk, lost his keys, and broken into his own apartment to go to bed. They thought it was my apartment and were confused by the lack of broken windows. I was terrified at the time, but it's a good story now. Story 3. When I was a kid and lived in my old apartment, my mom befriended the downstairs neighbor and would often invite her over for coffee and tea because she was always so lonely. A few weeks went by without hearing from her, so we both went downstairs and knocked on the door. It was like a scene from a movie. When we knocked, the door slowly crept open as if it had been that way for a while. We walked inside and found her in the bathtub, covered in blood, and the smell was disgusting. Apparently, the lady's girlfriend had left her, and she couldn't handle the pain. My mom's way of comforting me was, "Don't worry, Mark. She was our friend, so she won't haunt us." Gee, thanks, Mom. Story 4. I was living in my car for a few months. I would just drive out of town and park off the side of the road on logging roads or wherever to sleep. I found this one place to park, which was nice because it wasn't too far away, but also far enough that no one else would be there at night. The first night I was there, I had a waking dream that someone was outside my car looking in. It freaked me out, but whatever. I parked in other places for a few nights. I went back there for a few nights and had similar freaky nightmares both times. Someone outside the car, trying to get in, etc. I basically said forget this place and avoided it for a while. One afternoon I was tired and decided to go back there to take a nap. I laid there for about 10 minutes before hearing a noise, and suddenly there's this other homeless guy walking his bicycle down out of the bushes, right past my car. I recognized him as someone who roams around picking bottles out of trash cans. Creepy as anything. I guess he lived in a camp in the woods right there. Story 5. In third grade, I had this strange, short teacher named Mrs. Todd. She was always super nice to me in class. She'd always call on me to do the fun activities first, compliment me whenever I did something, and was generally just very positive toward me. At the time, I thought she was perhaps my favorite person in the world. I remember even telling my mother about how much I loved Mrs. Todd. Anyways, one day I sat down at my desk and opened it up to put some things in it, when I was shocked to see that there was a Victoria's Secret magazine sitting in the pull-out drawer. The kid sitting next to me noticed how surprised I was. I thought I was going to get in trouble, and we started talking about how it might have gotten there. Almost immediately, Mrs. Todd walked up and asked, "What have you got there?" I was seriously confused and told her it was sitting in my desk when I got there that morning. She looked at me and said the kid sitting next to me must have put it there. She kept repeating that statement over and over again, to both him and me, until I finally admitted that I guess he could have put it there. Maybe a few days later, she approached me after class to tell me about this special field trip I could go on if I kept doing well in class. It would be a trip with just her and me to the Gulf of Mexico for the weekend. I remember being really excited about it at the time. However, suddenly she got replaced at the school, and we got a new teacher who didn't like me as much. I was so heartbroken at the time. It wasn't until many years later that I realized how disturbing that situation actually was. It still scares me when I think about it. Story 6. When I was a teenager, I was home alone one weekend, and I was sleeping in my parents' room since there was a TV in there. Sometime around 2 a.m., I felt like I was being stared at from the direction of the hallway. I looked up and saw a shadow figure watching me. It was weird because it was a pure man-shaped black mass, and I could see him in the dark hallway. I'm guessing the light from the TV helped. I sat up and stared back, but I was terrified. We looked at each other for probably 5 seconds, and then it turned and walked down the hall. A few seconds later, I heard a loud crash. I was so scared I turned the TV to the Disney Channel and stayed awake for as long as possible. When I woke up the next morning, I walked down the hall to the bathroom, and that's when I noticed a mirror that had been hanging on the wall had fallen and shattered. My family still doesn't believe me, but I know what I saw. Story 7. This happened recently. It was midnight, and I was at the train station waiting for my train to arrive. There was this really tall guy walking toward me carrying a suitcase. As he came closer, I noticed he was struggling to carry it as it looked rather heavy, and oddly enough, it was leaking some sort of liquid. Not water, but something thicker. As this guy approached, he ordered me to take the bag. The tone of his voice was a little aggressive, and he didn't sound sober. Taking a closer look at him, I noticed he was covered in dirt up to his face, with cuts on his forearms. I said, "Sorry," struck for words, and started to walk away. My train started to arrive, and the guy followed me, saying things I couldn't quite understand. I hopped on the train, the doors shut, and he stood outside, pointing at me and yelling more gibberish. As the train slowly departed, he suddenly punched the window in frustration, with his eyes locked on me. Relieved to be on the train, fellow commuters looked at me, puzzled by the commotion between me and that guy. Story 8. When I was about 8 years old during recess at school, I noticed a bunch of other kids outside a storage room yelling and warning others not to approach the door because there was an eyeball staring back at you. I was curious because I didn't understand what they meant, but I could see their fear was real. Their faces were pale white as they tried to deter me from taking a peek through the keyhole. I remember bending down slightly so I could get a closer look inside, and sure enough, there was an eyeball staring back at me. It freaked me out so much I peed my pants on the spot. It was only later in the day, after I ended up at the nurse's office because of the commotion US kids had created, that a janitor went into the room to inspect what this was all about. Turns out someone had placed a mirror against that door, and the eyeball we were seeing was just our own reflection. Story 9. This was a few months after I had moved into my house. I had a long weekend, and I was at home just doing some cleaning and cooking. While my food was in the oven, I decided to go for a quick shower. I was drying off when I heard the beep, 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 beep sound of my oven timer, letting me know it was time to take the food out. I wrapped myself in a towel and went into the kitchen. I got the food out, started some sides going, and then went back to clean up in the bathroom and get dressed. When I walked back into the kitchen, I noticed there was a small blood splatter on my white-tiled floor. Naturally, I freaked out. I whipped around and walked right out of the house because my mind was instantly filled with thoughts of someone breaking in, cutting their leg on broken glass, and hiding somewhere in my house waiting to attack me when I least expected it. I called my then boyfriend to tell him I thought someone was in my house or something weird had happened. He was at work and couldn't come, so I called my neighbor, told her the situation, and asked her to please come over for a while. She agreed that the blood spot was very strange, and together we grabbed knives and slowly opened the doors to the extra bedrooms and closets. No one was there. At that point, I became convinced they had to be hiding in the basement and started panicking because my basement is huge and extremely creepy. We went down braced for the worst, but there was nothing there but boxes and spiders. After not finding or hearing anything strange, I calmed down, my neighbor left, and I cleaned up the blood. I told my boyfriend I was fine and tried to go about my day, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. I didn't hallucinate the blood on my floor. It was definitely there. How the heck did it get there? Was someone lurking nearby? Did I have a mouse that injured itself? A few hours later, I used the bathroom and noticed I had started my period. I was really embarrassed and ashamed when I connected the dots and realized that when I squatted to take my food out of the oven, I must have dripped a drop of blood onto the floor. Story 10. When I was 4 years old, my father, stepmother, and baby brother all died in a highway collision with a semi-truck. They had parked on the side of Highway 84 in West Texas between Lubbock and Abilene. They stopped to check on the baby, who was having a fit. The semi-driver had been over his driving hours and veered onto the shoulder, hitting their car while going downhill at about 70 miles per hour. The car was stationary. No one but the semi-driver survived the impact and resulting fire. Being 4, I hadn't spent much time with my father since my parents had split. So to this day, I have no recollection of him at all. But I ended up attending Texas Tech in Lubbock, and as a result, drove past that same exact spot on my way to and from DFW to Lubbock. I decided to research the incident and found an article written by someone who had witnessed the accident and called for help. They lived in a nearby house, at least up until when the article was published online. They described seeing a young family, my family, walking along the side of the highway after the crash, continuing their journey but never getting closer to their destination. Sadly enough, they were coming from Albuquerque to Houston to pick me up for a few months. I was at a loss when I found that story. I broke down, which felt strange because I never really knew them. They're part of me, and I don't even know who they are. I tried to find the spot where it happened by asking locals, who surprisingly remembered the incident from the late 1990s. I was able to find the approximate area and took a few moments of silence while I was there, just to show respect. It's one of the stranger stories I have. Story 11. My wife and I stayed at a small rental property in Bath, UK this spring. While in bed, I heard the gate to the property, right outside our bedroom window, open and close quietly. This immediately made me jump up and become alert. I heard someone trying to quietly walk on the gravel walkway to our front door until the motion sensor light came on. I saw a person's shadow dart against the wall outside our room and instantly went into defense mode. I ran into the kitchen, grabbed a knife from the wooden block, and stood at the front door ready to react. It was silent for way too long, and then I heard someone running away and the gate slammed shut. My wife said that once the motion light turned off, the person took off running. I have no idea what their intentions were, but I almost seriously injured someone that night. It still gives me goosebumps thinking about it. Story 12. When I was 7 years old, I was walking to my babysitter's house all by myself. She only lived a block from the schoolyard. I'd done it all the time. A car pulled up beside me on the road, and the driver kept gesturing for me to come closer and shouting, "Come here, come here." I was frozen on the sidewalk, shaking my head no, while my knuckles turned white clinging to my backpack. All he said before driving off was, "Stay away from Christina," and then I never saw him again. Christina was one of my on-again, off-again friends in grade school, along with another girl who alternated between hating me and being buddy-buddy. I had completely forgotten about the incident after a while and went on having a back-and-forth friendship with both of them. In 5th grade, the other girl invited me to the pop machine in the back hall at lunch. Cool, okay. Quality time with a girl I'd known since I was a baby? Sure. We got back to the classroom, and Christina told me that people had been messing with my lunch and hiding my stuff, but she was nice enough to bring it back for me. I started drinking the pop I'd brought for lunch, and something was really off. I spit it out and ran for the water fountain to rinse my mouth. Turns out Christina and her sister had topped up my drink with Lysol. If I'd drunk much more, I probably would have been seriously ill. The police were called, and a restraining order was placed on both of them. It was pretty ineffective, though, because the school was so small, there wasn't a separate class to put them in. They got 3 and 4 day suspensions. I have no idea if the two events are related, who that man was, or how he knew Christina was dangerous, but that memory has stuck with me ever since. Story 13. I was about 12 or 13 years old. One time I was walking to my psychiatrist for my weekly appointment. It was a half-hour walk, and after dark, I enjoyed walking, especially after dark when things were quiet, peaceful, and slow, and no one else was around. No, I didn't live in a dangerous neighborhood, nor did my walk take me through any dangerous areas. As I was about halfway to my destination, a Cadillac came down the street. Some people, both male and female, were sticking themselves halfway out the windows and taunting me as they drove by. They looked to be in their late teens or early 20s. I ignored them and kept walking. About a minute later, the same car came down the street again with the same taunts. I didn't know who they were. Maybe they lived in the neighborhood. I kept walking. Another minute went by, and again they drove by yelling at me. Now I was worried. They were circling the block, clearly focusing on me. As soon as they turned the corner and were out of sight, I ducked behind some bushes in someone's front yard and waited. The car came again, but not seeing me walking, they stayed silent and drove past. I think they assumed I'd reached one of the houses and went inside, so they drove off. I thought it was over. I was wrong. I left my hiding spot and kept walking. I should have stayed hidden longer because soon after, I heard the car again. They spotted me and resumed taunting as they turned the corner. This time I ran toward my destination, but I knew I wouldn't get far before they caught up. I quickly hid again, this time behind some bushes in front of an apartment building. I resolved to stay put until they gave up. I hadn't been there more than 30 seconds when the guy who lived there came out, asking what I was doing hiding in his bushes. At first, he probably thought I was a burglar, but I explained I was on my way to my psychiatrist and was being followed and harassed. He could instantly tell I was telling the truth. He could see how scared I was. Just then, the car came down the street and stopped right in front of us. The guy with me wasn't mean-looking, but he was serious, tough, and fit, wearing only a sleeveless undershirt that showed his toned upper body. He gave the car a hard stare and asked me, "You know them?" I explained I didn't, had no idea who they were. Then from the other direction, 3 more people approached on foot. That's when I realized what was happening. While the cars circled the block, a few of them had gotten out to trap me between the car and themselves. But seeing me with this man, they abandoned the plan and got into the car. It drove off. The man offered to stay with me a bit longer or let me wait inside his apartment. I had a feeling that was the last I'd see of those people and didn't want to be late, so I thanked him and continued on. As I left, I glanced at the closed door and hoped I hadn't made a mistake refusing more help. But thankfully I was right. I didn't see the car again. The rest of my walk was uneventful. I got to my psychiatrist's office and told him what happened. He insisted on calling the police, who came and took a report. That was the last I heard of it. Usually I'd walk home the same way, but that evening I took side streets. I never saw that car or those people again. Story 14. My sister and I lived in a haunted house in Thailand when I was 10 years old. We shared a room, and there was a Jack and Jill bathroom connecting to another empty room. I guess back then, and even now, maids are affordable, so we had a maid. She would always yell at us for leaving the ceiling fan on, but we never went in that room. It was upstairs, and when we were downstairs, we would hear kids running, bouncing balls, and laughing in that room. One night before all the weird noises started happening regularly, my sister and I had a friend come over for a sleepover. We made blanket tents in the empty room, but there was an armoire in there. With the lights off and just chatting, we suddenly heard scratches on the wall and froze. Then the armoire doors suddenly creaked open, and we all bolted out of the room. It was one of the scariest experiences ever. Later, we found out that behind our backyard fence was a swamp, and some local people told us that a lot of infants had been abandoned there over the years. Story 15. This story happened at my old house in Toronto. Three of us lived on the main floor of a house, and a stranger lived in the basement. We didn't know much about the guy downstairs except that he was a big gamer and smoked a lot of weed. Almost every night, I could hear him below me coughing uncontrollably, like he was about to collapse. I heard this often and started to realize that the sound wasn't coming from directly beneath my room. He seemed to be coughing in a room under our garage. Sure enough, my roommate and I went to the garage, jumped up and down, and could hear a hollow space below us. Eventually, the guy moved out, and we were able to move our friend into the basement. It was our first time down there, and I was excited to see this mysterious room under the garage. Our friend took us into the laundry room, which was below my bedroom, and that's when we discovered a creepy little red door leading to a cement room filled with trash and old furniture. It was basically a dungeon. This was where he smoked weed every day? It was full of mold and seemed unsafe to breathe in. Our friend didn't understand our fascination with the weird room because he was upset about the condition of the apartment. I was surprised since it looked like the previous tenant had moved out and our friend had moved in the very next day. Not much time to clean, right? But then my friend told me the guy had actually been gone for 2 weeks already and nobody had cleaned it. I thought about this for a second and got a cold chill down my spine. For the last 2 weeks, while the guy was supposedly gone, I could still hear the horrible coughing coming from that creepy room. Story 16. My parents sent me to live with my grandmother when I was 7. They had to work in another city for a couple of months while waiting for my older brother to finish middle school. I was ecstatic to live at my grandma's, since she spoiled me a lot. She lived in a 2-bedroom house with 4 of my aunts and my uncle. However, 3 of my aunts and I all slept piled into 1 bedroom, while my uncle and grandma slept in the living room. The reason? One of my aunts had schizophrenia and had a whole bedroom to herself. My aunt had been mentally ill for years. My grandma wasn't great at making her take her medication, and she would spend hours talking to herself and drawing with crayons on the wall. Looking back, it's really creepy. But as a child, I was having a blast living in a house where I was the most sane person around. That all ended rather abruptly when I woke up one night to my aunt standing over me, pointing a pair of scissors at my neck. The most plausible explanation is that she just wanted to cut a strand of my hair, since she had picked up a habit of cutting people's hair for a few months. But we never knew for sure. Almost immediately after that incident, my parents picked me up and moved us to a very old house where earthworms would come out of the toilet and shower drain at night. As a kid, it felt like I had woken up in a living nightmare. Story 17. This happened just a few years ago, back when I was still involved in a line of work many people would frown upon. I was young and desperate, and I figured if you're good at something and enjoy it, you might as well make money doing it. I never had any issues with most of my clients, probably because I was polite, respectful, and also because I'm tall and built and can be intimidating if I need to be. This was one of the most unsettling encounters I ever had. I only ever agreed to something like this once, and that was because the gentleman I was meeting with was extremely persuasive. Looking back, I suspect he may have put something in my drink or food because I felt strange and very intense that time. I know you're not supposed to eat or drink anything when visiting a stranger's house, but he came highly recommended by a friend, so I felt safe. And honestly, I was a bit hungry. After we ate, we entered his bedroom, and I noticed plastic sheets on the bed and a little beneath it. In certain cases, people request protective sheets for specific reasons, but usually that's something mentioned beforehand. I assumed he was just being extra careful to avoid getting oils or lotion on his bed. He brought out a dark wooden box and placed it on a table beside the bed, between some candles. As I helped him get ready, I noticed that he had a surprising number of scars, especially on his chest and back, but also on his arms and legs. It was unexpected for someone so refined. I assumed he might have been self-conscious, and that was why he was offering more than the usual rate. The massage lasted about an hour. Afterward, as things progressed, I was preparing for the final part of the session when he suddenly opened the box and revealed what was inside. Then he told me what he truly wanted. He was persuasive, and I don't fully know how I went along with it, but I did. It was the only time I ever engaged in anything involving blood. It was a surreal experience, and something in the moment just overwhelmed me. Honestly, I would have probably left if he had told me his preferences before we met. But the timing was strategic, and he presented it in a way that kept me from backing out. The whole encounter was intense, and I admit it stirred something in me I didn't expect. He even said he appreciated my passion. I still suspect I was drugged. We were alone, but the feeling that someone or something was watching us only grew stronger as the night went on. Strangely, it didn't scare me. In fact, it heightened the atmosphere. By the end of it, I was paid very generously for my time. I moved to another city not long after. About 3 months later, my friend contacted me and brought up the same client. He said everything would be paid for, and we just had to schedule a time. I told him I had moved on. He kept trying to persuade me, even saying the gentleman would come to my city. I refused each time. It was very hard to say no. The offer was extremely tempting, but I have strong instincts, and something about the whole thing felt deeply wrong. Eventually, they stopped asking. Story 18. I was a kid when this happened, so just keep that in mind while reading this story. My great-grandmother had recently passed away. We weren't particularly close, but every time I went to my grandparents' house where she lived, she would always smile at me and give me a thumbs up. I don't know why, but that thumbs up always made me smile and laugh a little. One day after school, I was thinking about my great-grandma and remembering her thumbs up. I got home and ran downstairs. About halfway down, I tripped. At the bottom of the stairs, there was a gate, and the ceiling was only about 7 feet high. The gap between the top of the gate and the ceiling was maybe 4 feet. When tall people walked down, they had to duck at the last step to avoid bumping their heads. Logically, I should have either hit the ceiling or crashed through the gate, but instead I landed softly on the ground. My very first thought was of my great-grandmother, smiling and giving me a thumbs up. It was so strange. I was just a kid at the time, so maybe I had a wild imagination. But even now as an adult, I remember that moment clearly. It's a vivid memory that has never left me. Story 19. I was in my mid-20s walking home from work across my local park. It was summer and broad daylight. The park could be sketchy at night, but during the day it was usually safe and busy, with people relaxing and walking their dogs. I always took a shortcut through a small gate in the middle of the park that led out to the road. On this particular day, 2 young men were standing near the gate. I had a gut feeling something was off and thought maybe I should avoid them. But I convinced myself I was just being paranoid and kept walking. I figured I'd just ask them to move when I got there. As I approached, one of the men suddenly disappeared from view, while the other started calling out to me, "Hey, you got the time?" That's when I noticed the second guy crouched behind the bushes nearby. I took a few more steps and realized there was a car parked close to the gate, and at least 2 more people were crouching beside it. Everything suddenly clicked, and I turned around immediately, speeding up as I walked away from the area. The same guy shouted again, "Oi, oi, you, what's the time?" My adrenaline kicked in as I made my way toward another exit from the park, walking as fast as I could. They didn't follow me or call out again, but I was terrified the entire walk home. My hands were shaking so much when I finally got to my front door, I had trouble turning the key. To this day, I fully believe I avoided a very dangerous situation. I've never doubted my instincts since. Story 20. Years ago, I stayed for a few nights at a hotel in the New Forest, a national park on the south coast of England. The hotel was a large former hunting lodge built in the 19th century. From the moment I stepped into my room, I felt uneasy, like someone was watching me, or as though there were others in the room. I'm not someone who usually gets those kinds of feelings, but they were incredibly strong and deeply unsettling. I was with a large group staying there, and after the first night, several others told me they felt the same. That first night, it took me a long time to fall asleep. For the first time in my adult life, I couldn't bring myself to turn off the lights before bed. When I eventually drifted off, I had the most vivid dream, so real it felt more like a memory, of being in a trench during the First World War. I could hear the constant thudding of explosions and artillery fire. I woke up in a cold sweat, extremely distressed. Outside, there was a real banging noise, possibly from loose metal roofing, but it only made everything feel more surreal. I had never experienced anything like that before, and haven't since. The emotions were overwhelming, and I couldn't fall back asleep. I had the intense feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone or something was very close, watching. I stayed up the rest of the night in a fog of fear and confusion. In the morning, I went down for breakfast and noticed a framed display on the wall. It contained old photographs and a short history explaining that the hotel had been converted into a military hospital during World War I. I hadn't known anything about that before I arrived, and I hadn't been watching or reading anything related to the war recently. I consider myself a practical and skeptical person, but I honestly don't know what to make of that experience. I ended up spending the rest of my stay in a friend's room. The heavy atmosphere didn't go away, and even my friend admitted they were unsettled and were glad to have me stay with them. Story 21. Only scary because I was there. In one day, I had two close encounters with elephants. First, while on safari, our guide stopped in a clearing. As I was getting out, he suddenly freaked out and told us to get back in the car. As we did, an elephant burst into view, trumpeting and charging. The truck failed to start once, then twice. The third time, still nothing. Finally, on the fourth attempt, the engine roared to life, and we sped out of there. Turns out, we had unknowingly parked between a mother elephant and her calf. We spent the rest of the day laughing it off because, honestly, what else can you do? That is until later on the path back to camp, we came across a bull elephant, drunk. Apparently, there's a tree with sugary fruit that elephants knock down, leave to ferment, and later eat to get intoxicated. This bull had clearly overindulged. We spent about 3 hours being false charged by this elephant, completely unable to move. If we did, he would have realized we weren't just some strange green rock, but something far more smashable. And we couldn't simply speed off because the truck wasn't very fast in reverse. It was a long, exhausting day for everyone. I especially felt bad for our guide. That was his first day back on the job after 2 years off. He'd been charged by an elephant before and had taken a tusk to the side. Story 22. Probably my entire life would count as a disturbing, scary story. My mother and grandmother were extremely overprotective when I was a child. I wasn't allowed to visit friends or family, walk down the street, go outside alone, or even cook or drive. It only got worse as I got older. When I was 19, my mother still wouldn't allow me to get a job. She told me I had everything I needed at home and didn't need money. I finally decided enough was enough. I saved up money from doing laundry, collecting loose change, and hiding away what I could. I had to keep it hidden, or she would take it, saying all money belonged to her. I packed my bags one day and tried to leave. She tackled me to the ground and with my grandmother's help, dragged me back inside. She reported my phone as stolen so I couldn't call for help, and even slept beside my bed to make sure I didn't sneak away. One day she took me to a church meeting and had people pray over me for hours, convinced I had some kind of spiritual issue. No one would help me. She had convinced them all I needed saving. A few weeks later, I managed to get a bus ticket, but she recruited a cousin to trick me. My cousin told me she was going to help me, that she just wanted to talk. Once I got in the car, she locked the doors. It had child safety locks. They drove me back home, and I was kept isolated for an entire year before I could finally get help. Some relatives even parked their cars in the driveway to prevent me from escaping. Story 23. I'm in my room sitting in front of my computer, working late at night as usual. I needed to use the bathroom, so I got up and quietly headed out. I was staying with family for a few weeks, so I tried to be super quiet to avoid waking anyone. To get to the bathroom, I had to take a kind of U-shaped path. I'd stayed in this house many times over the years, so I knew the way by heart, even in the dark. I stepped out of my room, turned left, walked a bit, turned left again, went down the hall and entered the bathroom. I turned on the light, finished up, turned the light off, and started making my way back to my room in the dark. I didn't want to disturb anyone by turning on the hall light, so I was basically walking blind. I made the first right, walked a few steps, made the second right, and then, wait, something felt off. I thought I saw a shadow move. I froze and listened carefully. Nothing. I took another step, and I swear I saw a figure, shadowy and silent, moving toward me, straight out of the solid wooden door to my room. I stopped again, panic starting to build. It was the creepiest thing I'd experienced since childhood nightmares. I used to have some disturbing ones, like dreams of my father trying to hurt me. I wasn't imagining things now. I saw something in the dark. I reached out and grabbed the doorknob, and again the dark shape moved, getting bigger, closer, and harder to focus on. My heart was pounding. I seriously considered calling out for help, family or not. And that's when my nose bumped into the mirror that hangs on the wall next to my door, angled at 90 degrees. Turns out I had missed my second right turn and gotten disoriented. What I saw was my own shadow moving in the mirror. Probably the scariest nothing that's ever happened to me. Story 24. I began receiving creepy texts and phone calls, but never thought much of them at first since prank calls were pretty common back then. The messages and calls would come in consistently for a few weeks and then stop. I'd forget they even happened until they started up again. Around my junior year, the calls began to get more disturbing. They started contacting both my house number and my cell phone. This was around the time cell phones were becoming more popular. So while some of my older friends still had my house number, it wasn't something I gave out anymore. When I started dating, they began calling my boyfriend and telling him disturbing things about me. Sometimes they even knew where I was at that exact moment and would urge him to question my whereabouts. It caused a lot of problems between us. But like always, the calls would stop. And apart from occasional anxiety and wondering who it was, I tried to put it out of my mind. Fast forward to college, I stopped talking to most of my high school friends, deleted old social media accounts, and cleared out my friend list. I wanted a fresh start. I was still dating the same guy, but had very little contact with anyone from before. Then halfway through my freshman year, the messages started again. This time, they included even more personal details. Just like before, they would stop right when I started considering reporting them. During my sophomore year, I moved out of the dorms and into an apartment with 3 girls I had met the previous year. One night, the text started again, but this time, they threatened to digitally manipulate images of me and send them to people I knew. I tried ignoring them, but the text wouldn't stop. I blocked the number, but more messages came in from different numbers. I was completely creeped out. I changed my number the next day. By now, I had no idea who it could be, but I had become paranoid and withdrawn. I stopped trusting anyone but my boyfriend and slowly fell into depression. Sometimes I thought it could be someone from high school, but I could never prove it. A few months later, I was at a concert with my boyfriend. He got drunk and we had a huge argument over it. I went home to my parents that weekend and got in around midnight. At 2 a.m., the calls started coming in, this time to our landline. One after another, men were calling and saying inappropriate things. We tried blocking the numbers, but new ones kept coming in, so we just unplugged the phone. The next morning, I had to explain everything to my parents, how it had been happening for years. We filed a report and changed our landline number. Turns out someone had posted my number on a classified ad site, pretending I was offering services I absolutely was not. That's when I started to realize the one constant in all of these incidents had been my boyfriend. The argument that night didn't feel like a coincidence. I knew I had to leave, but it wasn't easy. He was very manipulative, and I had isolated myself from everyone else for years. But that summer, I finally ended the relationship. It took me a while to heal and feel safe enough to date again. When I did, I met a wonderful guy, now my husband. I told him about my past experience, but thankfully I had distanced myself from it enough to just acknowledge how terrible it had been and move on. Last year, however, I started getting anonymous messages again. I had a new phone, a new number, a new group of friends, and had cut off contact with anyone who might still be connected to my ex. So when it happened again, I was terrified. What scared me even more was that the texts only came through when I was with my husband, and they were clearly meant to make him question me and cause conflict between us. We decided not to ignore it. We filed another police report, this time naming my ex as a suspect. I changed my number again and limited the people who had access to it even further. Thankfully, the messages stopped. The detective tried to contact my ex, but he never responded. I think he realized I was serious about pursuing legal action. I was lucky because technically I didn't have solid proof that it was him, and anonymous harassment is very difficult to pursue legally. But the fear of exposure seemed to be enough to stop it. Looking back now, I realize how disturbed and manipulative that relationship really was. I don't know if the early prank calls were connected to him, but the way we met now feels strangely calculated. It once seemed romantic, like something out of a movie, but now I'm not so sure. I hope those early calls were just coincidences, but I may never know how far he went to control and isolate me. What matters most is that I got out. I'm healthy again, and I'm safe. Story 25. In my culture, when someone dies a violent death, it's customary to burn their clothes immediately. My uncle, who was known to be difficult and deeply troubled, died in a tragic and sudden way. He was dragged by a car and thrown into a ditch. The coroner's office later released the clothes he was wearing at the time of his death. My uncle had warned his sister, my mother, and his wife not to look at them, but curiosity got the better of them, and they decided to take a look. I followed them downstairs, but they made me wait outside the room while they went in. While we were down there, we heard a loud crash upstairs. We rushed back up to find that a bunch of glasses had shattered, and no one else was in the house. It was the middle of winter, and the house was isolated in the countryside. My aunt and mother were visibly shaken, but tried not to dwell on it. In our tradition, wakes last 24 hours, and someone must always stay with the body. A family friend who was leaving the wake passed by the site of the accident and claimed she saw my uncle, looking exactly as he had in life, smiling at her in a way that made her deeply uncomfortable. The next morning, on the last day of the wake and just before the funeral, my other uncle mentioned that he'd been awakened at 4 a.m. by the sound of boots crunching on the snow. He stepped outside with a shotgun, but no one was there. That's when my aunt and mother confessed. They had looked at the clothes. My uncle reminded them that he had warned them not to. They built a fire and burned the garments. He was buried the next day. After that, there were no more incidents. No one in the family has experienced anything unusual since. Story 26. One night I was going out with two of my guy friends. We planned to walk to a bar, but a quarter of the way there, we realized it was too cold and decided to grab a cab. There was a taxi parked in the lot of a Royal Farms nearby, so we approached it. The driver seemed to be napping, but woke up when we tapped on the window and motioned for us to get in. So we did. He pulled out of the lot, but into the lane of oncoming traffic, and started weaving back and forth across the road in an S pattern. Thankfully, no cars were coming, but we asked him to stop so we could just get out. I was sitting in the middle. When we stopped at a red light, both of my friends quickly jumped out. As I started sliding across to exit, the driver suddenly hit the gas, running the red light with me, still half inside the car. I was screaming, holding the door open with my foot, terrified that if it closed, I'd be locked in. My friends were running behind the cab, yelling and throwing whatever they could to get the driver's attention. Then he veered sharply to the right and sideswiped about 8 parked cars, on the same side where I was keeping the door open with my leg. Luckily, we hit another red light, and I managed to scramble across and exit through the driver's side door. As soon as I hit the ground, the light changed and the cab sped off. My friends had gotten a blurry picture of the license plate, but it wasn't clear enough to give to 911. My leg was badly bruised, but otherwise I was okay. It was hands down the scariest experience of my life, and to this day, I have no idea if they ever caught that driver. Story 27. When I was 13, I experienced what I believe was the presence of my grandmother's spirit. She had passed away peacefully in her sleep while napping on the living room couch. Afterward, my father and grandfather would occasionally hear familiar sounds. Footsteps from the bedroom to the kitchen, and the fridge door opening, just like she used to do when she was alive. I thought they were just telling stories to spook me. A couple of years later, my dad and I went to stay with my grandfather for a weekend. We slept in the living room, on the same couch where my grandmother had passed. That night, my grandfather went next door to play poker with a neighbor. My dad fell asleep quickly. I stayed up reading a magazine. After a while, I heard the back bedroom door open, then the sound of slow, shuffling feet. The floor creaked in front of the bathroom. Then more shuffling. Then the fridge door opened, and I heard the clinking of glass bottles. Soft drinks used to come in glass back then. Feeling thirsty, I got up, expecting to find my grandfather in the kitchen. But when I got there, no one was there. That's when I remembered. He hadn't come home yet. I got spooked and ran back into the living room, jumping into bed next to my dad. I eventually fell asleep. I don't know how long I slept before I woke up with a start. I felt paralyzed with fear. I was lying on my right side. It took everything I had to slowly turn my head. My face was covered by the blanket, but I could see a shadow cast onto the fabric of a head and shoulders. The silhouette had a beehive hairdo. My grandmother always wore her hair that way, even after it went out of style. I heard heavy breathing. I worked up the courage to lift the blanket. In an instant, the shadow and the fear vanished. My dad was still asleep. I pulled the blanket back over my head and tried to sleep again. But later I woke up the same way. Paralyzed, shadow, breathing. I lifted the blanket again, and it stopped. This repeated several times throughout the night. I lost count of how many times it happened. The next morning I told my dad what had happened. I expected him to tell me I had imagined it, but instead he smiled and said, "That was Grandma." Story 28. During the 1970s, before I was born, my dad worked as a trail guide in California. He would lead groups of tourists on horseback across mountain trails and met a lot of people during that time. One of them was a Native American man who started out as a regular customer and eventually became an employee. He came from a reservation, though he never said which, and didn't explain why he left. He was kind and good at what he did, so my dad never pushed for details. He figured the man had his reasons. One day my dad, his brother, and their Native American friend were out on the trail with a group of tourists. It was a normal day. My dad and uncle were trading jokes, their friend was laughing, and the tourists were snapping pictures. Then someone shouted, "Coyote!" and pointed into a little valley nearby. Nothing unusual. This was the chaparral of Central California, and coyotes were a common sight. They all paused to watch. As the guests looked on, my dad and his friend chatted, but my uncle kept staring at the animal, his face puzzled. My dad asked him what was wrong, and he said, "This coyote doesn't look right. It had long, thin legs and an odd gait, almost like a camel, moving both legs on one side at once. Its snout was unusually long, and it held its nose high in the air, like it was sniffing something." My dad suggested it was probably just deformed. His friend, however, said nothing. He had gone pale and was shivering slightly, staring at the animal. My dad touched his shoulder and asked, "What's wrong?" His friend pointed at the coyote and whispered, "The tail. Look at the tail." My dad looked again. "What do you mean?" "It has no tail." That's when things got quiet. His friend said he would explain later, and they continued down the trail. The coyote followed them, not closely, but always nearby. The tourists were amused, thinking it was tagging along for fun. But my dad's friend never once turned to look at it again. When they were close to base camp, the coyote suddenly leapt from the brush about 20 feet ahead of them, causing the horses to panic. It stared directly at my dad's friend and gave a wide, teeth-baring grin, not the kind dogs do when panting, but a full smile that showed yellowed, stained teeth. The friend reached into his bag and pulled out a small piece of wood with an arrow burned into it. He held it up. The coyote looked away, then let out a howl, low-pitched, wet, and guttural, like it had fluid in its lungs. Then it vanished back into the woods. Back at camp, the friend refused to share much, only saying things like, "It killed them, and now it's coming for me." He told my dad and uncle, "The less you know, the better," and gave each of them a carved wooden charm with an arrow symbol. "These will protect you," he said. "I'm glad I got to test them." That night, he left camp at 8 p.m. My dad never saw him again. My dad used to tell this story often when I was growing up, especially on camping trips. He'd always smile when telling it, but sometimes when the wind is cold and the trees rustle at night, he says he hears that deep, rattling howl, and it never sounds like any coyote he's ever known. Story 29. I grew up in a one-room schoolhouse. My great-aunt's husband's family had owned the whole hillside, a massive farm, and what eventually became my home had once been used as grain storage and later as the local school. It shows up on maps as far back as 1844, but I haven't been able to trace it further. Back when it was still a school, a young boy reportedly tried to sneak in one night, probably on a dare. He pried open a window, but it slammed down on his neck, killing him instantly. Fast forward to my 17th birthday. I had a few friends over, 5 or 6 girls, for a party, and we pulled out a Ouija board just for fun. As soon as we started, the messages came fast. So fast, in fact, that we had to grab a notebook to keep up. The board spelled out the story of a 12-year-old boy and said he had always watched over me because my smile reminded him of his sister Gertie's smile. The board asked me to go into the library, just a walk-in closet packed with books, and open the window. I started to, but the moment I stepped inside, I felt such a powerful wave of fear that I ran right back out. I ended up researching my house for a school project shortly after that. I discovered that a boy really had died there at age 12, and his sister's name was Gertrude. Ever since, whenever I reach for a book, I whisper an apology for not opening the window. But I also have mixed feelings. If the boy's spirit really was watching out for me like he claimed, it didn't feel that way. My mom struggled with alcohol, and someone in our house made my childhood very difficult. So sometimes I wonder how much I believe any of it. Still, I can't help but whisper sorry into the library from time to time. Story 30. This reminded me of a somewhat similar event that happened when I was in middle school. My best friend at the time lived only about a mile from school, so we would walk to her house most days and hang out for a while. One day, when we were literally 2 blocks from her house, an older man pulled up alongside us and offered us a ride. We kind of laughed it off, not really understanding how serious the situation was, and politely declined. He slowly rolled along the curb as we walked, continuing to try and convince us to get in, saying things like it would be his pleasure to give us a lift. Then he focused his attention on just my friend, trying to convince her alone to get into the car. She had developed early and already had a noticeably mature appearance for her age, so I assumed that was why he targeted her specifically. I don't remember exactly how it ended, but I think we made it to her house and that's when he finally drove off. Looking back, that man was clearly acting inappropriately, and I had no idea at the time how serious it was. Now I realize just how lucky we were that nothing worse happened. Story 31. My dad worked a lot when I was a kid. He had taken on a second job delivering computer parts on the weekends, and since we didn't see him much, he let me ride shotgun once a week. That 2-hour trip was the highlight of my weekend when I was 7. I'd wake up early on Saturday excited to go. We had a tradition. The route always started with a stop at a little EZ Mart, where I'd get a pack of pink extra gum and one of those store-brand ice cream cones. On one particular Saturday, I told my mom goodbye and walked to the front door, but suddenly I was overwhelmed with fear. I started crying uncontrollably, begging my mom not to make me go. I remember feeling terrified, and I couldn't explain why. My mom was taken aback and said, "Okay, it's all right. You don't have to go." She went back to the kitchen to make breakfast, and I stayed home and played with my Barbies. About an hour later, the phone rang. My dad had been driving his old Bronco too when he heard a strange noise in the back seat. He turned to check it, saw nothing, and then looked back at the road, only to see a mailbox directly in front of him. He overcorrected and rolled the Bronco 3 times before sliding to a stop on the road. He walked away with just bumps and bruises. Computer parts were scattered across the highway, but the passenger side, the seat I would have been in, was completely crushed. The only thing they found intact inside the car was a pink pack of extra gum. Story 32. I was 16 and living with my dad. One night I was getting ready for bed when it felt like someone sat down at the foot of my bed. I felt the weight shift the mattress, and the box spring let out a slight creak. I was lying on my side, facing away, so I slowly half-turned toward the sensation. I could just barely make out the outline of a shadowy figure sitting there. The moonlight filtering through the blinds gave it a shimmering effect, almost like the kind of camouflage distortion you'd see in a sci-fi movie, but made entirely of darkness. I froze. Every hair on my body stood up. Not wanting to startle it, or maybe not wanting to find out what would happen if I did, I slowly laid back down, keeping my eyes on it the entire time. It was facing away from me. I don't know if it knew I was there, or if it simply didn't care. After what felt like forever, I slowly pulled the blanket up over my face and silently started to cry. My heart was pounding. I had never been that scared in my life. Eventually, I felt the weight lift from the mattress. I lay there listening, paralyzed, afraid to peek. Then I heard hangers jangling from the closet. That broke the tension. I threw the blanket off and sat up, but the figure was gone. I went to check, and inside the closet, a few clothes that had been neatly hung up were now lying on the floor. Story 33. A couple of years ago, my boyfriend and I went on an impromptu road trip. We packed up the car, brought our dogs, and headed north to the redwoods in far northern California. I was somewhat familiar with the area from childhood visits, and it felt adventurous to just hit the road with no specific destination. A few nights in, we ended up meeting a friend of a friend, grabbing some drinks, and she invited us to crash at her house for the night. We happily accepted. It saved us from paying for a motel or trying to find a camping spot late at night. She lived in an old Victorian house that looked incredibly cool. Normally, she had 6 roommates, including several guys, but since it was summer and most of them were students, only she and another female roommate were home that night. So it was just the 4 of us, plus our dogs. We had a few beers, hung out for a while, and then went to bed. The roommates were upstairs, and my boyfriend and I, along with our dogs, were set up on a futon downstairs in a sitting room at the front of the house. It had a fireplace and big bay windows that looked out into the front yard, which was well covered with bushes. We both fell asleep easily, but were suddenly awakened by the sound of the doorbell ringing. It was one of those old-school deep-toned bells that echoed through the house. One of the roommates came downstairs, looked outside, and saw nothing. She went back up to bed. We thought it was a bit strange, but figured maybe it wasn't uncommon for the house. We fell back asleep. only to be awakened again by the doorbell. This time the roommate came downstairs, checked again, and saw nothing. She walked into our room afterward and asked if we heard it. She clearly seemed unsettled. We all agreed that if it happened again, no one should open the door, and assumed it might be a doorbell malfunction. A while later, I woke up to one of our dogs growling, a low, deep growl I'd never heard from him before. This dog loves everyone, even strangers, and he's used to city noise, so him growling at something in the middle of the night was highly unusual. We tried to calm him down and assumed it was just the unfamiliar setting. I drifted off again. Then suddenly, I woke up to my boyfriend leaping out of bed and slamming his hand against the bay window, just a few feet from us. There was a man's face right outside the window, staring in. My boyfriend immediately grabbed the camping axe we had nearby and chased the man down the street. Whoever it was must have gotten the scare of their life. The noise woke everyone in the house, and we ended up staying awake for the rest of the night, taking turns keeping watch. What unsettled me most was the idea that the man had likely been watching the house, trying to figure out who was inside. If he just wanted to break in, there would be no reason to ring the doorbell repeatedly. I think he was trying to see if only the girls were home. The thought still gives me chills. Story 34. A few years ago, my husband worked the night shift. He typically got home around 6 a.m. after a 45-minute drive. One night, I decided to let our 2 kids watch a movie in my bed on the laptop. It was already pretty late, around 10 p.m., so I figured they'd fall asleep and they could just stay in my bed for the night. I locked up the whole house, got everyone ready for bed, and we started the movie. About 40 minutes in, I heard what sounded like someone walking through the dining room. My bedroom is directly off the dining room, and with the hardwood floors, it's easy to hear footsteps. I usually leave the dining room light on for my husband, so I had my door nearly closed, just an inch open to block out most of the light. I figured he had come home early and just hadn't come in yet, so I kept watching the movie. After 5 minutes of hearing someone walking back and forth across the dining room, and with no one coming into the room, I decided to check what was going on. I paused the movie, told the kids to stay put, and opened the door. The footsteps immediately stopped. No one was there. I searched the entire house, checked every room, every window, every closet, and all the doors. Everything was still locked. Nothing was out of place. Then I heard a meow and laughed at myself for freaking out over the cat. But when I walked into the kitchen to feed him, he was sitting outside on the back porch. The door was still locked. That's when my husband called. He was still at work, 45 minutes away. He told me to make sure everything was locked up because someone a few streets over had a break-in earlier that day. I completely broke down crying. I was absolutely terrified. Story 35. This still creeps me out. As a kid, I had very little supervision. My mom worked day shifts and my dad worked nights, so he'd usually be asleep during the day. That meant I had most of the day to myself until my mom came home. I'd usually spend a few hours watching TV or playing with toys, but I'd get bored after a while. When that happened, I'd grab the home phone and retreat to my room. I found it really entertaining to press random buttons and see who answered. Most of the time, I just dialed nonsense numbers. Sometimes I'd get lucky and accidentally call a real number. When someone picked up and realized I was a kid, they'd usually scold me and tell me not to call strangers. One day, though, I dialed a number and a man picked up. I asked him who he was, and he paused for a moment before telling me he was Santa. Naturally, I was beyond excited. I was young enough to believe him without question. I spent the next 10 or 15 minutes bombarding him with questions about the North Pole, reindeer and toys. It all seemed innocent enough until he told me that one of the elves had misplaced my address. He said I wouldn't get any presents unless I told him where I lived. The problem was, I didn't know my own address at that age. I remember bursting into tears, trying my hardest to remember what it was. I ended up running into my parents' room and waking my dad up, shouting, "Santa needs our address!" He wasn't happy. He yanked the phone out of my hands, but by then, the man had already hung up. After that incident, my parents made sure I never touched the phone again without permission.